So this one I kind of want to talk about, but I want to be very careful how we approach this because I feel like anything that comes from a translation, right, we have to kind of look at it a little carefully because there is a language barrier here. There's a cultural barrier here to talk about. But there were some comments made by Miyamoto regarding The Legend of Zelda Wii U and what he basically – our headline was Miyamoto doesn't like to call Zelda Wii U open world. And this was in response to a shareholder question at a meeting, which was very recently where Satoru Iwata got reelected and there were approval ratings all around for most of the board. The question was, when will you announce more? Oh, by the way, this was the same meeting where someone made a complete fool of himself by talking about, I don't like video games. And blah, blah. Did you hear about that?
No.
Iwata should resign.
One investor said...
What's he doing there?
No, it's like, he has a point, too. Like, everybody jumped on the guy.
Wait a minute.
But the way he made the point, first of all, it's translated from Japanese, so probably the way it sounds in Japanese is not that bad.
Fair enough.
But he said, how come we're all talking about the future of video games and all that kind of stuff? I don't understand video games. Why are we not talking about the business of Nintendo?
And
so the point is actually really smart, but the way he said it, it sounded like, why is Nintendo talking about video games?
Okay. All right. I kind of see his
translation
point.
things aside, but still, if you
That's
choose
really
to buy stock or attend a shareholders meeting for a video game company, I think there are reasonable expectations for what you're getting there, and that's a very weird statement to make.
Does he go to Toyota and he's like, "What's up with all these cars? This doesn't make any sense."
I don't think that's really what he said. And you got to remember, it's not like anyone from the off the street can attend these meetings and ask questions, right? Like that's probably a big shareholder. It's somebody who owns a good chunk of Nintendo, and he's frustrated that we're talking about like gameplay concepts. There was one question from a guy going like, "Hey, can shareholders have perks like free stickers and stuff?" It's like, come on, right? Like. If I was in attendance, I'd be like, "Can we talk about what you're going to do next with the company, please?" Right? But to say don't talk about video games is equally crazy.
Yeah, I agree.
But anyway,
so
the other thing was this.
So he basically was asked the question: when will you announce more information about the new Legend of Zelda game for Wii U? Will it be before E3 next year? And then he kind of walked through. No, we're not going to talk about this at these meetings. This is not what these meetings are about. However, he introduced that, yes, the next Legend of Zelda for Wii U is an open world. And then he kind of went into this with his statement. I prefer not to generally use the term open world when developing software, but we use this term at E3 in order to make it easier for our consumers to understand. This term means that this is a large world in which players can do numerous things daily, basically explaining what the concept means. But then he also goes on to say how the new world is vast. Maybe he doesn't want to call it open world, but whatever. In the tradition of the Legend of Zelda series, the player would play one dungeon at a time. For example, if there are 8 dungeons in the fourth dungeon, some players may think, I'm already halfway through the game, while others may think, I still have half of the game to play. We're trying to gradually break down such mechanisms and develop a game in which you can enjoy The Legend of Zelda freely in a vast world whenever you find the time to do so. So I thought we should talk a little bit about what we think Zelda Wii U will sort of, what does that mean, sort of the open world or the vast world concept? And I think Zelda is particularly trying really hard to shake that.
I think the point he was trying to make is it's not a sandbox game. Like, that's exactly what I think he was getting at. He's like, when we say open world, it means that it's a big open world and you can do things out of sequence. And they've been building towards that with the last game on 3DS, for example, Link Between Worlds. I think that's the point he was trying to make. And I think sometimes developers get scared that they overpromise, right? Like, look at Peter Molyneux, where he's like, in my next game, trees will grow as you watch them. The entire world is going to change. And then in the end, it's just a bunch of people farting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Nothing against Fable fans, but
British people.
That's the takeaway I had. And so I think sometimes designers get scared, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, the next game is going to be open world," and Miyamoto's sitting there going like, "Well, not like Skyrim,
I mean, maybe we should explain this to folks. So when you say not sandbox, we were specifically talking about sort of an open, vast world where the progression path is set through specific missions only, right? Like you play GTA and you can jump in any car, you can find side activities to do, you can go to a strip club, whatever it is. Sorry, this is a family show. However, the progression path is still sort of that linear structure of, okay, go from this mission to this mission to this mission. Are you therefore saying that this next game, when it's not sandboxy, is trying to break that? Because I think that's what they're going for, but I'm not sure.
I think that's what I heard. I heard that we're trying to move away from the convention of having a linear progression path in story where it's like, by the time he gets to the fire temple, he's already strong and he does this and this. I think they're just trying to give you more freedom as to where you go first. And, I mean, let's face it, the open world, like Link to the Past was an open world. Once you were able to pick up things, you can go anywhere in the environment, but it was flat. And a lot of Zelda games do things that you can do in Grand
first
Theft
Zelda-
Auto,
the
where
first
you
Zelda
do
was-
little side quests, right?
Yeah,
like you don't have to do them. I think they're breaking that up. I think there'll be a set storyline, but it will not matter what MacGuffin you get at what point in the quest.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that for years now, it's been sort of the, Link wakes up in his house, then he has a conversation with somebody, he has to collect 3 things. And then from there, some crazy stuff goes down.
They open something.
And he's got to collect, 7 things,
Yep.
right? And then another thing, and then the game is over. And I think that's what they're sort of moving away from. And I think even within the confines of that 3 things to 7 things or whatever it was, there was room for exploration. Like, I just started Ocarina of Time over on the weekend because I was flying across the country and I had my 3DS, and I was like, hey, let me check this out and just kind of go back to playing Zelda. I've been very hyped on Zelda since E3, obviously, and that game is very open, and it's there's a lot of points where they sort of shoot you down these narrow paths, but it does open you up in a Hyrule field, and it kind of says, hey, listen.
It's gradual.
Yeah,
see
what you can find.
And careful and deliberate.
I think what they played with in The Link Between Worlds, seeing that go full 3D excites me more than tricking my brain into thinking they're going to make GTA or Skyrim. Yeah. I think that the more people get into their heads that they are not making Skyrim with a green elf. They are making a Zelda with a little more freedom. That's the more realistic and accessible I think the game will be once it's finally out.
I think
with
risk,
set the expectations.
There's also risk, though, right?
Yeah.
I going back to Ocarina of Time. I loved going to a location where there's a dungeon and going I can't get in. How can I get in? And then going later in the quest, I'm I've got the hook shot. I remember there was a target above that thing, so I can go there. I like that progression too.
Yes.
It does feel like we've done this so many times now, but I'm worried now that the items will be less meaningful because they will no longer open up something cool. So they got to nail the side quests. The side quests got to be amazing so that they feel meaningful, and the hook shot, the bow and arrow, all these things have a purpose.
Yeah, I want to jump in with that because when you said sort of not having the MacGuffin and what that possibly means, right? When you look at A Link Between Worlds, they sort of tried to dial that back by making the item shop, but the item shop became sort of the one-stop place where you had to get everything basically and rent it and buy it, and that sort of loosened the design. But I think the pitfall, and in a lot of ways, the thing that maybe restrains it is, in fact, the toolbox. Because when you get to some of these dungeons, they were very one-item dungeons, right? They were very much driven by the idea that there is, at least at first, there was an emblem on the front door that said, okay, you need that thing to get through here and figure out what we want from you in this game. So I think that ultimately that's the struggle, right? How do you give the player all these tools, but still give them the discovery, but then still make the tools meaningful and not stuff that fall into the linear progression. Because that was something that happened to A Link Between Worlds, and I'm not saying it was necessarily bad. It was still a great Zelda for a lot of us. We enjoyed it.
And that's where a game like Skyrim is very different, right? Or Red Dead Redemption or any of these games. There are certain areas that will open up because of the story, right? You've been to the same place 15 times, you get to a certain point in the story, and now you have to meet that one guy in that same spot, and it triggers something, right? They could adapt that design for sure for a Zelda game as well, but the question is, will the items feel special?
Yeah, it's a really tough balance, and it's a really good point that going into a dungeon in the past always meant that you had everything with you that you had up until that point, which meant that if you had 6 items, all 6 of those items were going to be put into play in some way. And I remember Link's Awakening, in the first dungeon in that game, which is very, very early on in the game, you walk into an area and on the left there's a wall you can bomb. And behind it's some rupees. But I would say 99% of people do not have the bombs at that point. So I remember as a kid playing it and then coming back and bombing that wall and getting some rupees, and it was a small incentive, but I think working on that and building on that could be pretty cool to say there's reasons now for the first time ever to maybe go back to dungeons. And this is just me speculating, right?
No, for sure.
So now what could change, though? Imagine, first of all, I don't think they will not have a MacGuffin where they say collect 3 things. They are going to have that. That's it feels
just
like it's key to the story.
Rinse and repeat.
But I think it's going to be find the 7 sages. And what if each sage gives you a special power that doesn't work as a tool but actually as an attack power?
Sure.
Like, what if one is the flaming sword, so it makes it much easier to kill ice enemies or something, right?
Sure.
Like, that kind of stuff I could see them playing with and making much more non-linear in a game.
And I think with 3D, it really helps a lot, too, because, say, for example, you enter a dungeon and it's the boomerang dungeon, right? Like, as Jose noted in the other game, there's
monkey slapping his butt.
Yeah, there's a sign outside that says boomerangs only, and you go in there and there's, you use your boomerang. So what if in that same dungeon along the ceiling there's an entirely new hookshot path, right? That lets you traverse that dungeon differently had you accrued that item earlier through a different play. So had you beaten the third dungeon or whatever, because there's no numbers, and gone into the boomerang dungeon, you can travel along the ceiling.
See, I like that. So multiple tools for multiple purposes. You're designing the game around that, but you don't want. I think sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, that's pretty much kind of my dream. Is so you and I can both play that dungeon. You can be like, I played the boomerang dungeon. I'm like, what'd you think of it? And you're like, it was awesome for me. Did you go through the hookshot path on the top? And I was like, no, I didn't even have the hookshot yet.
That would be amazing. That's like Scribble Knots, right? Where you're solving a puzzle and you're like, helicopter, and then it goes, okay, now you can't use helicopter, and you're like, oh, rope, and dragon, and it's like, and now you can't use those two things. I love that kind of progression where everybody has a slightly different experience and you got to think of different things. What if when you replayed the game, you might get an item in a different order, and so then you would be replaying the dungeon in a completely different way.
And I think it would really inspire replays and stuff like that too.
Hard
so I feel like
game design.
Well, I feel like some of our most meaningful conversations too are the ones that we really walk away from like feeling satisfied, is when we all come at a problem in a different way. Like when we have a conversation about like The Wolf Among Us or Telltale's Walking Dead or games where there are sort of different options built in and you end up in a different place. That's really cool when that happens. And I don't know if that necessarily happens that many times with GTA. Maybe it happens a little bit with Watch Dogs. Maybe there are other games that kind of experiment with the process. But what I feel is that it's so much fun to like problem solve differently and look at how we all did it in a different way.
One of my favorite like weeks at IGN was when a bunch of us were all playing Heavy Rain and we all came in and said, "What did you do in this scene? What did you do in this scene?" And whether or not you like that game or not, it was a really cool. Some people if there's a scene in the game where if you fight somebody and he gets away, he comes back later. But if you kick his ass on the spot, then like that's the end of his story. So, and I saw some of that with Link Between Worlds, where I would come in and say, here's my story. I got into the world. I went to the hardest level first, and I died.
That's right.
And I was talking to Jose, and Jose was like, I went over here and kind of like got a feel for it. He's like, why did you go to that level? And I'm like, it looked cool. And he's like, it was surrounded by fire. Like, you knew it was going to be hard.
The warning signs were clearly there.
They're all there.
Yeah, you walked in and and this is an interesting problem to have too. And I know that for maybe someone listening, maybe it's blasphemy to compare like the way sort of experiences play out in these narrative-based games versus something with an open design or dungeon design like Zelda. But this is an interesting problem for Aonuma to have, because dungeons are so critical to Zelda. You can't think about, even when we've gone back and forth on Skyward Sword, the one thing we still kind of come back to is, man, the dungeons were great. Twilight Princess, man, the dungeons were good. Go back to A Link Between Worlds, man, those dungeons were good. Like, regardless of what happens, we always seem to really enjoy that the most. It's such an important part of those games. It's a really tough problem to solve.
Yeah, it is very difficult game design to make something that gives players different experiences, and you risk disappointing a player too. Like, what if Brian gets a boomerang in hour 1 and I get the sword in hour 1 and not the boomerang till hour 10? I might be really disappointed if I'm a fan of kind of more ranged combat and stuff, right? Like, I don't think they're going to go that way. Nintendo's always really respectful of wanting to make sure people have a good time, right? Like, get them right in. And, speaking of Star Fox Adventures, that game was not respectful. It makes you do a bunch of bull.
Yeah.
You picked up an egg. Twilight Princess did that too a little bit, to be fair. But, you picked up an egg, and it's an egg. Yeah.
So I think the way they'll do it is there'll be sort of narrative guide points that ensure that all three of us are getting the sword around the same time, or that there's not like that you're locked behind content or that you can't explore certain things, but like they do have a great system in place, which is the tap you on the shoulder, which is the fairy or Navi or whoever it is. It's just like, hey, you need a sword, man. Like, what are you doing out here? Come on, go back and get it, and then you can go check out the world. So,
okay. All right. So there are still sort of implications to some of these ideas with how that would affect story. And when you look at something as story-driven as Skyward Sword, you wouldn't have those cool cutscenes, maybe, or maybe it definitely alters the way that works. We should probably table that for another discussion in a future date, because we could talk about this for the rest of the podcast.